Welcome. My name's Cliff Freilich. I'm the executive director of Cinema St. Louis, presenters of the St. Louis International Film Fest. I'm joined by the director of Machine, Justin Krook. Very happy to have you, Justin.
Thanks for having me.
Let's start with the basics. I'm curious as to how you became involved in the film. Was this an original topic that you brought to others, or did they approach you to shoot the film?
They had approached me. I got hooked up with this company, Finch, in Sydney, and they had wanted to do something in the AI space. And I'm a tech geek. I jumped at the opportunity. For me, in AI, two things that really interest me are, number one, how confusing it can be. I think a number of people tend to overestimate where the technology currently stands and underestimate where the technology is headed and will be in the next 50 to 100 years. So I found a great opportunity to make a film that could help in that regard and give people a better look at, where the technology stands. And the other side of that coin is the ethical dilemmas that these technologies pose. So, yeah, having an opportunity to tackle that, I jumped at it.
And the film does a really deft job of both. It obviously addresses both of those issues in intriguing ways and uses many different angles to explore those. So it's a pretty thorough job. I am curious, people have seen the film already, so they know what you tackled. But I'm curious as to whether there were angles that you wanted to perhaps explore a little bit more and just ran out of time and space, essentially, that you thought the film was going to be spinning out of control.
I think there's more subjects and things we wanted to talk about that didn't make the film that are actually in the film. It's one of those subjects that touches every aspect of your life. So narrowing it down, we gave ourselves a challenge of, okay, let's narrow this down to 7 or so subjects. Number one, because it's exhausting to go through all these different things. And, we actually did a test screening, I think halfway through editing. I think we had maybe 8 or 9, and people, very positive feedback, but people just said, we got exhausted after 7. It's a lot of information, a lot of interesting questions being posed. But, a few things that I find interesting that aren't in are facial recognition, especially in regards to how it's being used for surveillance. It's an interesting subject that we just didn't have time to put in. And then AI and how it is going to affect jobs. I think that's another one that we tried to put in, but we did, as you just saw, 10 to 12 minute bite-size vignettes on these things. And when we dug into jobs, we just said, this has to be a whole job or a whole feature in itself, because it's just such a convoluted topic to try to tackle in 10 minutes. We thought would be doing it disservice.
Now, the film obviously strikes a nice balance between people who are offering more optimistic views of what AI could potentially do for humanity versus the people who have a much more skeptical and sometimes outright pessimistic view. I'm curious as to where you fall on the spectrum.
Well, I think it changed before I started making the film, and then by the time I finished it. I think when I started, I was a bit more pessimistic, and I think everyone's mind goes to these AI breaking the containment bottle scenarios that you see in the films. And then as you do a bit more research, you meet the people designing these things, and they're doing incredible things. And there's a lot of incredible applications, especially in, say, healthcare, which is another subject we didn't really totally get to dive into, where you realize, it's like any technology, there's incredible things that can come out of it and a lot of harm that can be done. But I think throughout making the film, I became a bit more optimistic, but only to a degree. And I say it with an asterisk, and I'm only as optimistic as I am about humanity. And that tends to fluctuate these days. But at the end of the day, these things are all tools, and it's how we use them. And I think at the beginning of the filmmaking process, I was more in the camp of, okay, let's blame technology for some of our woes or how it's being misused. But I think my realization in making the film is it's really comes down to how we use these things. And so I hope with the film we can get people engaged with the subject, because these things are only going to become more prevalent in our lives going forward. But I think it's, the last line of the film, is something along the lines of we can build the future we want. It's not predetermined, basically.
And you can choose what paths you want to actually pursue. You aren't required necessarily to build every machine.
And on that note, though, we should also be, engaged. And, I don't think politicians are really clued into technologies. And I think that's an area that I think as we vote going forward, there's the power that big tech companies have is getting only larger. So I think, in some regard, we can vote for a better future, but I don't really know many people that are on the ballot that have any clue.
Right. I think when you see Congress questioning the various heads of tech when they occasionally appear before, the cluelessness is quite evident. So that's a frightening aspect, because you hope that they're going to be sufficiently aware to take the proper action. That's not a certainty, obviously. Was there one aspect that you do find you're most optimistic about, that you think could really have tremendous value, that you can foresee us benefiting from in a huge fashion, versus an area that you're very skeptical of and that you don't necessarily think is something that we should be pursuing actively?
I think the most optimistic, the thing I'm most optimistic about would definitely be healthcare. A lot of the things we get sick from, a lot of the things we die from are completely preventable, especially if you catch them early. So I foresee a future where you have wearable technology, whether it's inside your body or out, that's always diagnosing what your blood pressure is, how your vital organs are working, what you're inputting into your body, and streaming this to the cloud and having diagnostics that know exactly. There's no reason we need to be catching cancer late or any of these things. So if you have technology that's testing for every cancer marker known, the barrier now is you can't go to see a doctor and get a scan every day. But if you've got that technology somehow, whether it's something you're wearing or something that's inside your body, I think the tech is limitless there. So that's all very exciting. I think on that note, there's some privacy concerns with data and stuff like that. But as far as it comes to healthcare, as long as it's not anonymized, I'm happy to share all my vitals and all my information if it makes a more healthy, resilient society. So I'm very optimistic there. What scares me is, as it actually put one of the stories in the film was about Facebook and some of the algorithms that are used to drive the information we see. And out of all the technologies, that's the most, we'll call it stupid version of AI. It's not very advanced, these algorithms, but I honestly think that is the most dangerous of all the different technologies, AI technologies we're seeing, just in regards to the fact that misinformation and being able to influence people, to me, is something that's not science fiction. It's something that's happening right now. And I think over the last 10 years, we've been able to see this diverges from the truth. And I think in large part, it's for people living in alternate realities. And I feel like a lot of that's due to the information they're being fed. And there's no longer these gatekeepers in journalism that are arbiters of the truth. It's everybody's version of the truth, and everyone can amplify whatever they think on the internet, which, had some promise, but now I think it's become quite dangerous. So that depresses the hell out of me.
Well, I have to say that it was exactly my thought as well, watching that particular section. Although the person that you speak to most prominently in that, it actually has a more optimistic view that it could be potentially used in a more positive fashion. But I think that requires, obviously, us making the decision to broaden what we receive in, whereas I think most people are sort of content to live in their little silos.
Yeah. When we did that story, we were like, do we go down the social dilemma route and just focus on the negative? And with some of these things, it's like, well, okay, there's a lot of press on this. How do we find the interesting little nugget or the little interesting angle of, sparking an idea in someone's head? And, because he mentions when Facebook started and these things, these were incredible for democracy. But then once other actors kind of figure out how the technology works, sometimes the bad outweighs the good.
Mhm. I'm curious, you came out of fiction filmmaking, obviously. You did your first several films, fiction narratives, and then you moved into documentary. I'm curious as to whether or not there were any fiction films that you used as, that were particularly inspirational to you, in particular your visual approach to illustrating some of these ideas.
Day one, when we discussed, what's this film going to look like, we brought up, which I think is the most poignant film in space, which is Her by Spike Jonze. I think what stood out about that film is that it was incredibly human. Even though it was a movie set in the future about technology, it was really about people. And so I think, per usual, Spike hit that one out of the park. And and I think that was the big inspiration for how to do it. Let's not, it's a sci-fi movie, sure, but let's make it human. Let's use a lot of warm tones. Let's focus on the human element. And so I would say that was incredibly influential in our decision making.
And that's where you start your film, with that aspect of AI, this notion of having a relationship with some form of AI. And so you can see a very direct influence there.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, what about, so that obviously guided to some degree what you were going to be concentrating on. Were there any other visual reference? I saw, there's obviously the one reference that I saw to 2001 with the baby floating, or the fetus floating, which is obviously an image that appears many different places, but we do associate it with that. And then of course Hal himself is very prominent. Was that at all on your mind, or?
A little bit. I think, one of the interesting visual kind of conversations we had with the visual language of the film is, how are we going to illustrate the technology itself, because it doesn't exist in a physical form. These algorithms and networks are, and we wanted to do it in a way that, made sense to someone who wasn't a computer scientist. So we talked to a number of computer scientists and engineers, and, we wanted to make sure we got it right and would visualize these neural networks in a way that would both make sense to, the layman, and also be somewhat accurate. So we spent, quite a bit of time figuring out what that neural network would be, and use it almost as a character throughout. And then using that visual language we then laid those visual effects techniques over top of the baby floating in space, as you mentioned, and try to make that a character kind of throughout the film. And we showed it to a few AI people when we finished it, and they said, I buy it. which was good. They're like, I don't think that's exactly what it would look like, but you did they gave us a pat on the back for, doing it in a way that wasn't, I guess, overly dishonest. So that was nice.
Well, you found a lot of interesting ways of visualizing. It could have obviously developed into a lot of talking heads, but you find a lot of really interesting visual aspects to illustrate some of the points, like the use of the sort of video game when you're dealing with the self-driving cars, the autonomous cars. I thought that was very clever.
We wanted to have fun. Like, the first thing I said is, this cannot be a boring movie, because I want everyone from, someone that's 15 to my grandmother to be able to watch it and enjoy it and get something out of it. I think that's the important thing about making a film. It's a conversation starter. You got to get people in and break down the barriers, because I don't want to make something that was only going to appeal to the tech crowd. So yeah, it was coming up with these, and most importantly, it was coming up with characters that were fun, that could crack a joke and have a laugh. And so the casting process was, I think, pretty important. We wanted people, that, number one, were respected in their fields, but could also tell a story and, not put our audience to sleep.
And of course, you do have a sex robot, right, toward the beginning of the film, which immediately grabs people's attention.
That was actually later on in the film, and we said, Okay, let's and as you mentioned, let's move our relationship to these technologies to the first story as an entrance into the technology. So that was our thought process there.
Speaking of casting, it would be remiss of me not to note the fact that there's a St. Louisan featured in the film, a physician at Barnes Jewish. Do you want to talk a little bit about how you stumbled across Dr. Luthart and what his role in the film ended up being?
Yeah, so we wanted to get healthcare into the film in some way, shape, or form, and we were looking at a number of different stories. And you know, I read an article on him, and the technology he's working on gets the imagination rolling. I think it's kind of in its infancy right now, but when you look at all the different applications of the technology, it might be the most profound, understanding who we are, how our brains work. I mean, there's no really more fundamental questions than these. So we thought, wow, what a cool more science fiction story with a practical application that's actually being used now. And yeah, you know, I'm sure he can describe it better than I can, but yeah, he was doing amazing stuff. And it was nice to see him working on something that had a very real practical application that can be used for strokes and curing epilepsy and stuff like this, but then also have that interesting sci-fi bent where, you know, you imagine being able to read thoughts. And, you know, these things are science fiction now, but they are working on them. You've got Elon Musk as well working on similar technology. So it's pretty, and that's exactly what I, you know, kind of started talking about at the beginning. People underestimating where these technologies can eventually go. We could be living in even though we're in our infancy now, we could be living in a pretty radically different place in the next 100 or 200 years. And as Dr. Luthart mentions, you know, whether it's 100 or 200 years, that's completely immaterial when you look at the full course of human evolution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the changes that we've experienced in the past 200 years, as you correctly point out in the film, are vastly faster, bigger than anything that occurred up until that point. So, so yes, it's both a frightening and also a potentially hopeful thing. It'll all depend on the choices that we make, obviously.
Yeah.
Before we go, we'll wrap things up, but I am curious as to whether or not you have a narrative film that deals with AI that you are especially fond of, other than her. You've already mentioned her, so that's clearly one that you think is inspirational. Is there another that you are especially fond of?
Yeah, I mean, it's like Captain Obvious, I guess, if I say this one, but 2001, I mean, I'm a huge Kubrick guy, so I wish I had a better answer, but I love that film. Great, love it.
I was just curious. You had a few choices. Blade Runner would have been another, and Ex Machina, I think, is really quite good. So
that was a really good one. Yeah, beautifully done. I actually like the new Blade Runner as well. I know it's got mixed opinions on that one, but I enjoyed Denis Villeneuve's version of that. So.
All right, well, thank you so much, Justin. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to join us for a conversation.
Yeah, love talking about the future of the world. It's fun.
Okay, great.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.